Kia ora koutou. Regenerative agriculture is a sustainable approach to farming that has recently grown in popularity as a response to the negative environmental impacts of industrial agriculture and climate change. And while the term regenerative agriculture might be new, the principles and methods actually have been around a long time. They've got ancient roots and were developed by various indigenous cultures around the world, as well as even way back in Neolithic times. And I guess the most important principles underlying indigenous regenerative farming systems and frameworks is how we understand our place in the natural world. The Western worldview has placed humans at the top as the dominant species, which is a very self-centered, kind of self-righteous view from an indigenous lens. However, humans are not above nature or separate from it. We're a part of it. And we have heaps of proverbs and sayings which reinforce this idea, like ko au ko te taiao ko au. I'm the environment and the environment is me. In Te Ao Māori, we believe everything in the natural world is imbued with a mauri or life force, and therefore it has its own intrinsic values, which is no more or no less important than ourselves. We also believe that through our whakapapa or ancestral heritage, we're genealogically interconnected and dependent on the natural world. And this is also reflected in our art, in our narratives, our sayings, and a good example is he oranga taiao, he oranga tangata, which refers to the idea that health and well-being of people is dependent on and determined by the health of the environment. And what that means is that your farming and resource management practices need to be aligned to and working in harmony with nature, and focused on long-term sustainability rather than trying to exhaust, exploit, or dominate over it for short-term selfish gains. Indigenous food growing systems and principles are driven by subsistence needs and not profits, and this is, I guess, a core concept of ecological sustainability and resilience, which doesn't seem to be driving Western ideology, consumerism, and the whole market system and the industrial food system. And just to quote an idea of Mahatma Gandhi, the earth can sustain human needs, but not our greed. Regenerative farming practices for indigenous cultures revolved around building soil health and fertility. And this was most commonly done through practices like crop rotation, cover cropping, intercropping, agroforestry, and polycrop farming, which is like a mix of different crops as opposed to the conventional monocrop industrial farming model. I've talked about agroforestry practices before, but in this video I'm just going to focus on crop rotation and cover cropping. Here in Aotearoa, we traditionally used an ancient practice where a patch of land would be cleared and sometimes burned to remove overgrown vegetation and leaving just the ash or the cut vegetation on top of the soil as a mulch. And they would then cultivate staple crops for 1 or 2 seasons, and then that plot would be left to regenerate for about 10 years and even up to 15 years. Usually the plots for dryland crops would be left a bit longer. Regenerating plot was referred to as a pātohe, and a rāhui or prohibition was placed on it to allow the regrowth of a diverse range of native pioneer plants, which during the fallow period act as a cover crop, protecting and rejuvenating the soil. Even though a pātohe plot was prohibited from cultivation, it could still be used for harvesting like a range of wild medicinal plants and even edible crops like the aruhe. And after the fallow period, which we called the pātohe sort of time, the whole cycle would be repeated, and a plot that was fully rejuvenated was referred to as tāmata. A lot of cultures throughout human history have managed to land this way, and not only with crops but also livestock using the same principles. Modern regenerative farming has evolved quite a bit and turned into a major field of science even, which has not only helped to challenge and change the whole industrial farming model, but it's also helped to confirm and validate our ancient wisdom and practices, things like Indigenous agroecology, which is our biodiverse kind of resource management systems, our holistic frameworks, our environmental knowledge of plants, wildlife, soil biology, ecosystems, and astronomical knowledge, and even our metaphysical knowledge, which are the kind of like the spiritual connections to the natural world, which altogether can offer kind of ancient solutions to modern problems. Indigenous environmental wisdom is essentially the result of thousands of years of observational and experiential knowledge. So modern science has only validated what we kind of already knew. And I guess the main difference with regenerative farming now and how it used to be done in the past is that there's a much wider variety of cover crops available, and that the time that a plot is left to rest is a lot shorter. So back in the day, they didn't have the invasive weeds that we have now, so they just let the native regrowth become the regenerative crop. And but now it's more common to use a blend of really fast, those fast-growing leguminous and carbon crops, which are deliberately sown into the field at the end of the growing season, and that in the fallow period, when the beds are put to rest, it's generally much shorter, like only a few months. Personally, I like to use a combination of both native and green manure crops, and the value of the native cover crops is that you get a bit more native biodiversity and microorganisms that you can still and you can still harvest certain crops like puha and other medicinal plants while the plot is in that regenerative or that regenerating fallow phase. So with cover crops, you not only get a heap of biomass growing above ground, probably more importantly, you also get the roots of those crops helping to break up, condition and aerate any compacted soil underground. And plants with heavy root systems like daikon are particularly good at breaking up hard soil, and you just need to let them die and decompose in the soil rather than pulling them out. And it's best to cut cover crops just before they go to seed and leave all the leaf and stems as a ground cover mulch, and the roots will eventually decompose and help improve the soil structure and fertility. If your soil is rock hard, cover crops alone probably not going to cut it, so to bring that sort of soil back to life, you might need to actually physically break it up first with a pickaxe or hoe, or just to loosen it up a bit, and maybe even work in a bit of organic matter, because even cover crops or weeds will still struggle to grow in this sort of hard soil. So yeah, that's it. I guess the principles and values that underlie regenerative farming are probably more important than the actual practices, because how you apply them will depend on your particular environment, climate, season, and what crops or animals that you're farming. So if you have any other Indigenous practices or principles that you're that you use to rejuvenate the soil, just let me know. I'll be keen to learn. So that's it. Mauri ora.